Okay, for our third lecture in sustainable forestry, let's take a look at some of the current issues in tropical forestry. We'll take a look at the start of and trends in tropical forests globally, current global issues, external forces on forests, science and the 21st century forestry, organizational trends and power in forest management, and finally we'll take a look at global outlook and opportunities in forestry in the Caribbean. So first of all, global tropical forest trends. We talked a little bit about Caribbean forestry and its situation in the last lecture. Let's take a look at what's happening around the world with tropical forestry and tropical forest use. The background to this all is rising global population. And it can be shown that world population, as it increases, needs more room to live, and quite often a lot of that room is forests. So as population increases, so deforestation has increased. And we'll probably see that continue because all of those people need something to eat. So when we talk about agriculture, agriculture needs to happen somewhere, and quite often forests is cut down to make room for that agriculture. So what's today? Today forests cover about 4 billion hectares, 31% of the land surface. Latin America and the Caribbean counts for about 22%, mostly in Latin America. The Caribbean doesn't really hold that much, unless you count the continental Caribbean countries of Suriname, Guyana and Belize. The islands don't really hold that much because they're fairly small, and a lot of the forests on those islands have been cleared anyway. The average global annual loss of forests, however, is about 5.2 million hectares during the last decade. So there's been a net loss of about 88 million hectares of forests, or 9% of the total area, in Latin America and the Caribbean. And during that 20-year period, most of that loss has been in the Latin American countries, the continental countries, because in the Caribbean island countries, as I said, most of the forests have been lost, and in fact we've probably had a net gain of forests in the insular Caribbean during that period, as people tend to drift away from agriculture and into the service sector, in particular tourism. So the factors which are fueling deforestation are listed there, and you take the pick of those, or the different, the underlying cause, the ultimate cause of this deforestation, and the ultimate cause of all these proximate causes which are listed there is population growth. You can take your pick of the different proximate causes which are causing deforestation in different countries. So different countries will different proximate causes will be the main cause for deforestation in those countries. Okay? Tropical deforestation is often a policy failure rather than a market failure. So basically what this is saying is that governments quite often encourage deforestation through taking the wrong sort of attitude towards forests. So basically governments which contain, or whose countries contain tropical forests, quite often see tropical forests as a suboptimal economic use of land. So if you can clear off those forests, or clear them for a short-term capital benefit, then that land can be used for a much more economic way of generating an income. So which would earn more money for a government and for an economy? Agriculture, short crop agriculture like sugarcane farming or oil palm plantations, or would a forest earn more money? Obviously the oil palm plantation or the sugarcane plantation would earn more money. So therefore governments tend to prioritize, or at least turn a blind eye, or don't look at clearing of forests for agriculture and for other economic land uses. It can be argued that governments are being short-sighted in this because forests do contribute to the economy, and it may not be in direct cash, and which can be taxed, and the government can get a share of that benefit, but things like services for, say, water production and so on are very important to a country, and forests quite often mediate these services. Some of the insular islands in the Caribbean do see the value of forests for tourism, which is one of their main their main income generators. So Central America and the Caribbean's high population densities and increasing urbanization will cause a shift away from agriculture, and therefore forest clearance may decline in some areas, may revert to forests. And this has happened in the insular Caribbean, and places like Puerto Rico, for instance, has recorded big increases in forest area since World War II, as people move away from agriculture, become increasingly urbanized. And we've also seen it in places like Trinidad, for instance, large areas of the... Yeah, sorry about that. Right, so Central America and the Caribbean high population densities, they're moving away from agriculture, and forests is increasing. In South America, on the other hand, Latin America, continental areas, forest clearance has increased, mainly because governments are, like I am saying, seeing these areas as areas for potential economic growth, and therefore they are converting forests to other land uses to increase their economies, and so better for their populations and tax incomes and so on. Okay? Right, so planting forests for timber is something which is happening in different parts of the world as people begin to realize that you can't keep on extracting timber from tropical forests all the time. There will become a time when tropical forests simply cannot provide the timber anymore, and so the price of tropical timber is going to rise. People are betting on this by planting plantations now, so that in 30 to 40 years' time they will have timber maturing at a time when the price of tropical timber is rapidly increasing due to lack of timber and increased demand. So planted forests are increasing, and quite often it's not governments which are behind these planting of forests, it's actually investment corporations and private corporations. Okay, so trends in forests for the LAC: reduction in natural forests and an increase in commercial timber plantations. Some of the global forest management issues. Tropical forests still remain to be the biggest reservoirs of biodiversity on the planet, and provision of services from the forests are quite often linked to the biodiversity. However, deforestation to increase economies in tropical countries is threatening that biodiversity and also threatening those services. Global climate change is also a big issue for tropical forests. We are beginning to see tropical forests responding to global climate change, and many of those responses are dictated by things like drought, changing rainfall patterns, but also increasing temperatures, which will drive increases in things like respiration, which will decrease the biomass in tropical forests and cause diebacks of different species. Okay, sorry about that pause. Here we go again. Global climate change, big impact on forests on both sides. First of all, forests are going to be affected by the change in global climate, but they also in themselves will affect global climate change because global forests sequester the largest amount of carbon in a biomass anywhere. So it's a huge amount of carbon, and if those forests are lost, then all that carbon will end up in the atmosphere, and it won't be such a good thing. So a lot of carbon stored in forests, so if we lose those forests, all that carbon is going to end up in the atmosphere. Conversely, if we plant more forests, then the carbon will be soaked up. So having large amounts of forests is in the best interests of many developed countries. So they're really turning around and focusing on tropical forests now and trying to think of ways in which they can make it attractive for tropical forest country governments, how they can make it attractive for them to conserve their tropical forests and then keep that carbon out of the atmosphere. So the best way of doing that they've found so far is to actually pay them to keep it in there under a scheme called RED, Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and other bad stuff, and we'll talk more about that in the next week's module, unless we've had it already. Okay, so climate change, sustainable forest management also is gaining ground. This is where we can better manage our forests for things like timber production and still preserve those processes, those ecosystem processes which are required for use of the forests for other things like biodiversity conservation, for instance, or carbon sequestration or water production. So sustainable forest management and a thing called reduced impact logging, which basically means trying to protect the forest while you harvest the timber from it, are gaining ground, more research. These things, these types of management strategies were piloted in temperate forests, but temperate mixed forest up in the southeastern United States, where timber is incredibly expensive, and so it makes sense to try and manage your forest to maximize your timber return but maintain all of your ecosystem services. Alright, there are external forces acting on forests, and in these days of globalization, a lot of economic forces and socio-economic forces means that there are a lot more, it's more immediate, these different forces bringing to bear on tropical forests. One of the first things that we see is changes in policy in governments. Now, governments still look at forests as a way in which to grow their economies and thus increase their tax base so that they have more money to spend on infrastructure and so on for their people. But another thing which is happening is increased engagement in non-governmental organizations in managing forests. Now, as you recall, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, most tropical forests are managed by governments because most tropical forests are owned by governments. But as middle classes grow and socioeconomics improve in different countries, tropical countries, you get more and more people with an interest in tropical forests for different reasons, and they are taking on more of a role in managing these tropical forests. In addition, policies are also shaped by tropical country governments signing up to agreements and so on, which quite often require them to conserve their tropical forests or manage them in a particular type of way. Be that as it may, places with large areas of tropical forests like Brazil, Indonesia, are still under a lot of pressure to monetize their land and clear off their tropical forests and plant agriculture, etc., etc. So places where there is strong economic growth quite often also have a concomitant reduction in their forest area. You'd only have to look at Indonesia and Brazil. For example, in Indonesia, large areas of rainforest have been burnt and deforested and planted up with oil palm plantations. In Brazil, large areas of the Amazon basin have been cleared and turned into cattle pasture. So economic output is the main goal of the governments in these areas, and as I said, it's a suitably social goal, and it is driven by underlying population growth. Trade is a big driver also. It's the thing which makes governments want to clear their forests and plant it up with agriculture and so on. And it will, as globalization bites deeper, it will create a situation where large economies like China and possibly India in the future buy up huge areas of land for their companies and for production of food to feed their own populations. So as land becomes more and more expensive in China and India, they will look elsewhere for land to produce food and other activities which require broad acreages. Australia is no good, it's too dry, but places like Africa and South America are increasingly being bought up by organizations from these countries, and investments are being made to clear the rainforests and start industries. All of this with the collaboration of the developing country governments, because it increases their economies, their tax base, and allows them to do more for their people. Timber products. Timber products are always popular. There's been a 6% increase in the last 20 years or so for pulp, paper, wood, and so on. And this is against a background of declining resources. So as you cut more timber from the tropical forest, that means there is less there, particularly if the timber is cut at unsustainable rates, which it has been largely in the past. So what happens is the price of these wood products goes up, and you rapidly enter a situation where increasing prices means more wood is harvested and so on. So the global increase in timber prices is driving greater amounts of harvesting of timber, but it is also making it more economic for conversion of tropical forest to plantations or conversion of agricultural land to plantations. So in Latin America now, the pulp timber which is required for paper is supplied mainly from plantations, usually grown with plantation eucalypts from Australia. Right, so agriculture, as we've talked about that before, there seems to be a shift from forest to large-scale agriculture, underpinned by the increase in global population and the more money you get for agricultural produce. It's likely to be exacerbated in the future when fossil fuel supplies begin to run out, as we saw in the oil price shock back in the late 2000s, when oil prices climbed rapidly, and suddenly many different agricultural areas were diverted into producing biofuels because it suddenly became economic. With the growth of middle class in many of these tropical countries, NGOs and CBOs are becoming more and more active in forest management. But international NGOs and so on are also being focusing on tropical forests and trying to achieve their goals. Quite often the environmental NGOs, such as people like Friends of the Earth, Worldwide Fund for Nature, they are all putting money into buying up timber leases and keeping forests without harvesting them. So in that way they are contributing to developing country economies, but maintaining forest areas. Some people are not particularly happy with this because they do tend not to increase the economies of these countries, and so tend to keep these countries in a stasis rather than improve the lives and living standards of the citizens. Right, still NGOs and so on. Alright, technology increases all the time. In forestry there are some improved technologies which have been used, but generally tropical country governments cannot afford these technologies, so they tend not to use them. In plantation forestry, one of the big advances in technology now is using irrigation. Many of the timber plantations which are established in Australia, northern Australia, are done so near an aquifer, so they can be irrigated, and this eliminates a lot of the variation in growth rates and so on due to seasonality and so on, and so it makes these timber plantations much more economically predictable and also minimizes the amount of time spent on growth, which is a pretty good thing. But most tropical country governments really can't afford that sort of investment. Wood processing technologies have also moved along at a pace. In Australia, a lot of the rainforest timbers now are available for using for wood chipping and paper production through development of lignin digesting systems which allow this timber to be broken down into a form which is suitable for paper production. But because tropical rainforests in Australia are now very small in extent, the timber is far too expensive for that sort of use, and now any timber which is harvested, which is minimal, tends to be used immediately in furniture and cabinet making. Some of the priorities for research in forestry would be information and communication technologies, remote sensing technology to monitor forest areas, and I would add in there also use of drones to efficiently inventory timber stock so it can be monitored and make sure that the timber is managed sustainably, precision logging systems, and biofuel technologies, particularly using cellulose and lignin in biofuels. At the moment they can't be used unless you just burn the wood. You can't make petroleum products out of cellulistic biofuels that you would get in trees and so on, because the digestion processes just haven't been developed. Alright, so organizational trends. Well, the main organizational trend is that from governments being the main body managing forests, you're getting a much more different array of players moving into the forest management market. You're also getting private investment firms recognizing that timber prices will rise in the future and moving in. You're starting to get carbon trading institutions moving in and paying landowners to maintain the forests so that they can get paid from carbon credits, people in the developed nations who try to offset their carbon footprints. So this has given rise to what is called a pluralistic institutional environment, which basically means more than one body now is managing these tropical forests. So this means that there is now a re-examination on how forests are being managed, and government forestry agencies, which tended to concentrate purely on timber production, are now being marginalized, and quite often, unless they adapt, they will probably fade into irrelevance. So what are some of the global outlooks? Long-term demand for global wood products is driven by demographic changes and so on. Basically, the prices of timber are rising, and they look set to continue rising, both through increased demand and decreasing in the production of timber. Added to that, with the increase in the biofuel industry, maybe in the future you will look to see increased demand for timber products. That will mean that there will be a greater awareness of the value of the products offered by tropical forests, and with an increase in global living standards, tourism will also become more important. All those tourists from China and India will move into tropical forests as Europeans and Americans do today, and that will increase the amount of money in tourism, which will again add value to tropical forests. And that's supposing that tropical forests are still there. Another big issue with tropical forests is payment for ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are the things like water production, pollination, and so on, which scientists are only beginning to uncover exactly how important they are for tropical country economies and also the global economy. Once scientists have sussed out all of these ecosystem services and how much they would cost if they were not there anymore, then the true economic value of tropical forests will become known, and they can be incorporated into tropical country government budgets. Red, we talked about that already, and so on. So that's about it. Please read the literature if you haven't done already up on the website, and thank you very much for listening.